The official record describes it simply as a wartime infrastructure project, a private construction effort undertaken in 1942 on the grounds of the Brandywine Creek Estate in Wilmington, Delaware. The DuPont family, America's most powerful chemical and munitions dynasty, filed the appropriate permits, employed the appropriate contractors, and the work was completed with minimal public attention. But here is the question that the official record never answers. Why does the Delaware State Police maintain a patrol presence around sections of that estate to this day, decades after any wartime justification could possibly apply? What exactly did the DuPonts build beneath the ground of their Delaware property in 1942? And why does answer remain something no public official will speak about on the record? To understand what happened beneath the Brandywine Creek Estate, you first have to understand what the DuPont family was in 1942. At that moment, the DuPonts were not merely wealthy. They were structurally indispensable to the United States government in a way that gave them leverage over institutions that, in theory, were supposed to govern them. The E.I. DuPont de Nemours Company had been the primary supplier of gunpowder and propellant to the United States military since the War of 1812. By 1942, the DuPonts manufactured the explosives loaded into shells fired in the Pacific, synthesized nylon for parachutes, and held classified government contracts, whose full scope was never publicly disclosed. When the War Production Board needed production expanded faster than any government facility could manage, it called Wilmington. That is the context. That is the leverage. When a family that essential to the war effort files paperwork for a construction project on private land, no federal inspector asks inconvenient questions. And in 1942, no federal inspector did. The construction project at the Brandywine Creek Estate was described in filings as a civil defense installation. The language was deliberately broad. The permits listed the project as a below-grade protective structure with communications capacity. The depth of the excavation was not specified. The footprint was not specified. The contractors who performed the work had signed national security confidentiality agreements, which meant their employees could not legally discuss what they built or they built it. Standard civil defense installations from this period have detailed construction records, measurements, material inventories, contractor payment ledgers. The Brandywine Creek project has none of those things in any accessible archive. The Delaware Public Archives holds wartime construction records for dozens of private properties in New Castle County. The DuPont estate filing exists in that archive, but it is a single page, one page, for a multi-week underground excavation project. Every historian who has noted this discrepancy has been told the same thing. The remaining documentation was classified under wartime executive authority and has not been formally declassified. 80 years later, records from genuine civil defense shelters built by other prominent Delaware families during the same period were declassified in the 1970s and 1980s as a matter of routine. The Brandywine Creek project file remains a single page. Why would a routine civil defense shelter require classification protections that outlast the war, outlast the Cold War, and persist into the 21st century? Or is it possible, and you should sit with this possibility, that what was built there was never a civil defense shelter at all? In the summer of 1942, the DuPont Company received a shipment of reinforced concrete forming materials and specialized waterproofing compounds in quantities that substantially exceeded what any personal shelter would require. The delivery records, which survived because they were routed through a commercial freight company that maintained its own independent logs, describe a tonnage of materials consistent with a structure of significant scale. Payroll records from a Wilmington construction firm called Harlan Brothers Building show a concentration of weekly payments during summer 1942, representing one of the largest single-site labor expenditures in the firm's entire documented history. The material volumes and the labor costs point towards something of institutional scale buried beneath that property, but the question of exactly what remains officially unanswered. When a researcher at the University of Delaware attempted to formally catalog these financial discrepancies in the 1990s, the research hit a very specific and very strange wall, which we will return to shortly. Here is the structural reality of the DuPont family's position in 1942. They were the largest private munitions producer in the country and one of the most politically exposed. The Senate Munitions Investigating Committee, led by Gerald Nye in the 1930s, had dragged the DuPonts through years of public hearings accusing them of being merchants of death, war profiteers who had benefited from American entry into the First World War. Pierre Dupont and Irénée Dupont had both testified, both been publicly excoriated, and both emerged with a very clear understanding of how vulnerable their family's position was to political pressure. By 1942, the DuPonts had every reason to want a facility that was entirely off the books, a location where materials, documents, and communications infrastructure could exist outside the reach of any future congressional investigation. Not a shelter to protect the family from bombs, a shelter to protect the family's interests from scrutiny, a hardened, permanent facility built to ensure that whatever the DuPonts needed to preserve would survive any political or legal storm. That is the motive. And once you understand it, the anomalies in the construction record stop looking like administrative gaps and start looking like intentional architecture. The waterproofing compounds in that 1942 freight record were specifically engineered for deep below-grade applications, the kind used in tunnel, construction, and hardened communications facilities. The waterproofing compounds in the freight records were not rated for 10-foot applications. They were rated for applications 50 feet and deeper. A separate set of freight records documents a substantial shipment of heavy-gauge electrical cabling and industrial switching equipment delivered to a DuPont supply depot in Wilmington, with the invoice destination listed as the Brandywine Creek property. The quantity of cabling is consistent with powering a facility of several thousand square feet, not a family air raid shelter. This was cabling for a serious electrical infrastructure, communications equipment, climate control. A 1943 maintenance invoice references a routine inspection of mechanical ventilation units at the Brandywine Creek property. The inspector's notation describes ventilation capacity corresponding to a multi-room facility with continuous human occupation requirements. Something was built beneath the Brandywine Creek estate in 1942 that was designed for continuous operation at significant depth, with serious electrical infrastructure and mechanical ventilation. In the post-war years, portions of the Brandywine Creek estate eventually became associated with Hagley Museum and Library, but not all of the estate transferred to public ownership. Certain parcels remained under private family control. The Delaware State Police have maintained, for decades, a periodic patrol presence around specific sections of the estate that are not publicly accessible. This is not disputed. What is disputed, what has never been formally explained, is the legal basis for that patrol presence and who exactly authorizes it. No one in the public record has produced a contract, a statutory authorization, or a budget line explaining how a private family's property security became an ongoing obligation of the state police rather than a matter for private security firms. The arrangement implies either that the state has a genuine interest in what exists on that property, or that the family's historical political influence has been converted into a durable institutional arrangement that serves private rather than public ends. The researcher we mentioned earlier, Dr. Margaret Hale, was a specialist in American industrial history with a particular focus on the relationship between private corporations and wartime government contracting. When she began documenting the discrepancies in the Brandywine Creek construction record and publishing preliminary findings in academic conference, Presentations in the mid-1990s, the response was not a scholarly rebuttal. It was something different. Her access to the Hagley Library's DuPont Company records, access she had held for years as a credentialed researcher, was quietly restricted. The specific collections she had been using were reclassified under a donor confidentiality arrangement. When she sought to continue her work through the Delaware Public Archives, she was informed that certain wartime construction records had been transferred to a federal repository and were no longer accessible through state channels. The federal repository she was directed to had no record of the transfer. When Dr. Hale published a short piece in an academic journal in 1997 noting these access difficulties, she did not receive tenure at the University of Delaware. She subsequently left academic history entirely. You are permitted to conclude that her departure was coincidental, that the access restrictions were routine, but you should be aware that you would be reaching that conclusion without access to the documents that might confirm or refute it. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the early 2000s as part of an environmental assessment of portions of the Brandywine Creek watershed returned anomalous subsurface readings in areas of the estate. The environmental consulting firm documented in their technical report a series of large subsurface voids consistent with below-grade constructed spaces, anomalous because they did not correspond to any structure on the historical property maps provided. The environmental report was filed with the Delaware Department of Natural Resources in 2004. The anomalous subsurface finding was included in a technical appendix. That appendix was subsequently removed from the publicly accessible version of the report. The agency's response, when queried, was that the appendix contained proprietary information provided under confidentiality protections. An environmental assessment of a state adjustment watershed, filed with a public agency, redacted to remove physical survey data about unidentified underground structures. Think carefully about what that sequence of events requires you to believe. It requires you to believe that the appropriate institutional response to detecting anomalous underground structures was to remove that finding from the public record, not to investigate the anomaly, to remove it. We have a 1942 construction project with a single-page filing where dozens of pages should exist. Freight records documenting materials consistent with a deep, large-scale underground facility. Payroll records showing labor expenditures far exceeding any personal shelter. We have a post-war pattern of state police patrols on private property with no documented legal authorization. A researcher whose access was systematically restricted after she began documenting these discrepancies. We have a 2004 ground-penetrating radar survey that found large subsurface voids in the relevant area of the estate, and we have the removal of that finding from the public version of the report. At what point does this stop being a series of unrelated administrative coincidences and become a pattern? The DuPonts built Wilmington. They financed Delaware's political infrastructure for generations. They endowed its universities, its hospitals, its museums. The line between the DuPont family's private interests and the public institutions of the state of Delaware has never been sharp. When a family of that institutional weight decides to build something beneath their property and keep it private, the apparatus of state government does not investigate. It accommodates, and that accommodation does not expire. It transmits forward through time as institutional habit, as political relationship, as the quiet understanding among people in positions of power that certain questions are not asked. The state police patrols at Brandywine Creek are not a mystery requiring a complicated explanation. They are the visible surface of an accommodation that has been running, without interruption, for more than 80 years. The federal government, which contracted the DuPont Company for classified wartime work, has its own reasons to ensure that the details of those arrangements remain unavailable. The Hagley Museum, whose institutional identity and endowment depend on the DuPont family's continued goodwill, has structural reasons to manage, rather than illuminate the family's history. The University of Delaware, which received substantial DuPont family philanthropy, demonstrated through its handling of Dr. Hale's situation that it understands where its obligations lie when research becomes inconvenient. This is no longer a story about one family's wartime construction project. It is a story about the way institutional power concentrates around a secret and becomes, over time, indistinguishable from the secret itself. Every institution that has managed access to this information has taken on a share of the interest in keeping it managed. The federal classification, the state police patrols, the Hagley's donor confidentiality arrangements, the environmental agency's redaction. These are not independent bureaucratic actions. They are the coordinated behavior of institutions that share an interest in a particular outcome. That the question of what was built beneath the Brandywine Creek estate in 1942 remains permanently unanswered. The physical structure, if it exists as the evidence suggests it does, is on private property with state police-enforced access restrictions. The construction documents are classified under wartime executive authority, never formally reviewed for declassification. The academic research that began to document the anomalies was terminated through access restriction. The modern technical survey data was removed from the public record. Every pathway to independent verification has been methodically closed. The only evidence available is the evidence that leaked through the system before the system closed around it. The freight records, the payroll documents, the original environmental report, the single-page archive, filing where dozens of pages should be. What was built beneath the Brandywine Creek's estate in 1942 is still there. The Delaware State Police still patrol the ground above it. The documents that would describe it remain classified 80 years after any legitimate national security justification has expired. And you, reading this or watching this, are not going to be permitted to verify any of it. Not because the evidence does not exist, but because the institutions that hold it have had 80 years to ensure that it remains exactly where they need it. Beneath the ground in Wilmington, Delaware, and beneath the reach of anyone who asks the wrong questions. The Brandywine Creek Estate. Remember the name. Every time a reporter files a FOIA request and receives a single page where 100 pages should be. Every time a researcher loses archive access after asking specific questions. Every time a state agency redacts a technical finding from a public environmental report. Every time the Delaware State Police decline to explain the legal basis for patrolling a private estate. The Brandywine Creek Estate is the answer to all of those questions, and the reason that answer will never be officially confirmed.